Hello, this is Jeff Gra, lead developer of Dominus Galaxia. We are starting a monthly development update that we're going to do in a video format. This first one will kind of cover a bit more than subsequent ones. It's going back to about January, where we came back to the project and development resumed. And we're just kind of going to go a little bit sequentially over the things that have changed. And there's small things and large things. The first thing that I think was added was a support for arbitrary aspect ratios. So previously, if the aspect was any lower than about 1610, then that wasn't supported. So if you had a 3:2 aspect or a 4:3 aspect, it would just show up with black bars. So the reason for this improvement to the way that the UI and the game works is, well, because I got a laptop with a 3:2 display and I wanted to play Dominus Galaxia with that without black bars. But also there's a porting progress, or there's a port for Android that's been going on, and we have a working build of that. Needs a bit of optimization, but devices can have different aspect ratios. They can be pretty thin. You can have portrait mode, landscape mode. And the way this works is if I expand the aspect ratio so we go more widescreen, we can see that everything kind of just slides across. If we look at ship design, then these panels just expand. Now, if we go to a very narrow aspect, something different happens. We can't keep on sliding it. We need to... There. The UI starts to shrink in order to fit everything in. So we could go super, super narrow. It just gets a little bit ridiculous at a certain point, but it still technically works. So if we look at chip design now, we can see how that shrinks and reforms. And yeah, it doesn't look great at an ultra wide aspect. It starts to look really stretched, but again, it works. It's good enough. Nobody's probably going to try and play it that narrow. Research works the same way. So let's expand that out again. Speaking of Android porting, we've also added some support for touch in general, and that applies for a mobile device, a touchscreen, Steam Deck, what have you. So the main difference here, well, there's a number of differences, but the most noticeable difference is going to be that there's an alternate UI for sending ships and fleets. So if we want to send a scout here, we can click on different destinations and it won't just send it, because that wouldn't work very good in touch. But we can still queue them up. So we could go there, add that, and then go to the next waypoint. So let's add that, and then let's say for the next one we want to go direct, skip the star lane. We can add that, and done, and there we go. So I think the next thing that was added, I'm just going to clear that. The next thing I think we added was a rework of the way that research operates. And there's a number of elements to this. So I'm just going to put some points into research and press turn so we can do our initial projects here. And the big thing is this meter and this theoretical research option. And the way that this works is previously, like Massive Orion 1, you had this field, the level of your technology field, which is something like 0 to 99 in Massive Orion 1, could go up infinitely in Dominus Galaxia. But this was based on this really not unintuitive formula based on the total number of techs in a field you have combined in some way with the tech that has the highest level. And that would drive your miniaturization. That would drive certain bonuses like spying, population production, etc. And unlike Master Orion 1, we had a specific project to advance to each new rung in the tech tree. And that kind of worked good, but I think this works a lot better. The way that this works is as soon as you fill this bar, this level up meter for the field, then you advance to the next rung. And at that time also all your miniaturization happens, all of your bonuses accumulate, and you get to choose a perk. So the way that this works is the cost of the technology ends up getting applied to the level up meter, but you can also drive the meter directly with theoretical research that gives you a 50% bonus to the speed that you fill it, or it invests 50% more research points. So I'm just going to select a few things, and in weapons I'm going to go theoretical. And we'll just type in a cheat code here and see what happens. So when I press turn, now I get all of these discoveries, and we're going to go like that. But weapons, now we have advanced the field to level 1. Weapons components have been miniaturized, and we can choose a perk. Perks are random. There's a number of them. You won't always get the same ones that come up. But here we can have cheaper bombs, cheaper special weapons, or troop weapon bonus for ground combat. So I'll pick that. And now we have a whole bunch of new options that we can research. So we'll do that too. So the research screen has changed a little bit too. You can see the progress in the meter here. And we got rid of the momentum system where you'd sort of slowly build up. Like if I were to put everything into propulsion, it would like start here, then go here, etc. So anything that you would reduce in focus would reduce immediately, but any increase would take time. So what we did instead was we just did something very simple, and I think Ray Fowler maybe did something similar with ROTP. I'm not 100% sure, but it's possible that there was that. But basically, the less equal your the proportion between each field, the less efficient everything is. So if I have a weapon that I want to rush, I have like, 3 or 4 times the spending, and I'm in weapons, but I'm only 90% efficient. So little adjustments like that actually doesn't make much difference. But if you want to completely mainline one technology, then it's only half. And maybe sometimes you want to do that, but if something is very critical to research, but you don't want to do that all the time. I think the next thing that was added was kind of under the hood. This ended up taking a lot of time, both to implement it and to fix all the bugs that came across afterwards. But the next thing was, I think I have a post on Kickstarter about this, but there was this big plan for combat that involved different facings, having reactors and energy and momentum and a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm not sure how well that all would have came together. But it's started to feel like I was kind of wandering the wilderness a little bit, and something really cool might have came out of it, but at the same time, it could end up also being worse, or at least more complicated, or less less approachable than the current system. At the same time, there was a whole bunch of refactoring and reworking of the combat system that was intermingled with those changes on that branch. And that kind of sucked because I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue with the mechanical changes, but I sure as heck wanted the behind the scene changes because they were very significant. So the way that combat first worked was the idea what was going to be that there'd be some sort of abstract simulation for background events, and for foreground events it would just be typical Unity code, game objects, all of that stuff if you know how that works. And eventually what ended up getting tacked on there was the ability for the background events to also use the same system to auto-resolve at any point in a combat event and have that simulation finish very quickly. And that created a number, well, wouldn't necessarily say issues, but it wasn't ideal because we were creating all these really heavy objects that we shouldn't be, and using raycasts and everything like that for these background events. And that's just kind of hidden from the player. And in order to do that in the background and not hang the screen at the same time, what would end up happening is we would just every few unit activations just yield and let the screen render. But when that's yielding for the rest of the frame, it's not doing any work. So that was very slow, especially when we had a lot of combat events. And the way that this is being reworked is basically to take all of that out. It more or less redid the combat from scratch. The mechanics are very similar, almost entirely the same. But the actual systems have been rebuilt from the ground up, basically, to not have zero dependence on the Unity engine. And right now, with that, there's very little dependence at all. Unity is mostly just used for user interface, input, and output. So the game itself is more or less pure C#, and then it just interfaces with the Unity engine for input, output. In any case, I am rambling a bit, so let's look at something. Butterfingers here. So, okay. So, one thing that was added more recently is because all these events are now, well, they're no longer dependent on the Unity engine, so we can shunt them off to background threads. So if we have 10 different combat events and 10 different cores, we can have one core per combat event, and it's all really, really fun and fast. But this thing right here is something that was added recently, and this might be tweaked a little bit, but this sort of shows a projection. And the S is for survive, the R is for retreat, the D is for destroyed. This is saying none of my units are going to survive, 93 to 100% will retreat, and 0 to 7% will be destroyed. And something similar on the enemy side, except for they're obviously winning this battle. If I go up to bold, then we'll see that most of my ships are probably going to be destroyed, but some of them will retreat. And the way this works is really cool, which is that we're basically taking a number of events or a number of instances on this event, just with starting with different random seeds, and looking at how like the minimum and the maximum. So I think by default we're doing 5 different events in the background. We don't actually apply the results of the events. Unless we hit auto resolve, then it will grab one of them and apply that one, so it ends up within this range, and we can do that now. So that's instantaneous because it's already being computed. We're just grabbing it. It's already computed from the background. And that's just in terms of software engineering. I think that's pretty darn cool. But the issue with that, let me pop one up again. The issue with this is that it's nice because you end up not going into a lot of events that would just be busy work. But at the same time, it almost feels like, at least for some players, when you have this, you just don't go into combat nearly as much as you would, and that makes it a little bit less enjoyable. So probably going to replace this with something more abstract. But in the meantime, in the game files, you can actually change whether this is enabled or not by changing the amount of instances that are computed in the background. So you could, if you want to, you could compute 100 different instances. It might take a little while, maybe a second. But if you go to 0 instances, then this is disabled altogether. So here we are in a combat event. And I should also say that a lot of the changes on the combat branch, those might eventually be brought back, but I'm probably not going to do a huge rework all at the same time. I'm probably going to try out different things individually and do it in more of an incremental fashion. Some of those aspects are actually supported here, they just aren't used. Like there's support for different firing arcs for different weapons. It's just not really enabled in the current rules. We did end up implementing all the remaining specials that you could research them, but they didn't actually do anything when you put them on a ship. And that's mostly subspace teleporter and repulsor beams. And these were kind of similar to the way they do in Master of Orion 1, but a little bit different also. There's also a few more specials that were added. There's a special that lets you reaction fire when anybody comes within your range. I don't think any of these units have that, but there's a few more like that. So the way that the subspace teleporter works here is we can teleport up to 6 spaces, and we have a little bit of a slightly different graphic here. So we can select a tile here and teleport to it like that. We have a nice little effect. And here we can actually see one of the quality of life improvements, and that's with this little dotted line from the missile, and it's telling us how much range it has. So if we could get here or hereabouts, then the missile would run out of range or would run out of fuel, and it wouldn't hit us anymore. Now repulsors is kind of interesting, and it works. It repulses a unit up to 4 hexes, and it also debuffs their defense for a little bit, just for 1 turn, but it can only fire twice in a turn. So I can repulse up to 2 of these guys, and there are 3 of them. When I repulse a unit, it actually, besides just shoving them over, it also spins them around so that they're facing away from me. So if this unit were taking its turn, and it had a lot of movement points, it might be able to turn all the way back around and come at me again, and then I'd repulse it again. But if it has a huge amount of movement points, it might be able to overcome that just by continually coming at me. Obviously, if there's more than 2 units, one of them should be able to get through. And the other way to counter the repulsors is if you have a teleporter and you teleport, you don't get repulsed. You only get repulsed when you start moving. So if I end my turn, that unit comes at me, gets repulsed, but it can't go past this unit, which was right over here, so it's still within weapons range and it hits me. So this is actually kind of interesting. Before, I think I talked about how the system was doing raycasts in order to look and see if something hits or if it's blocked. And that's problematic for a few reasons. One, it relies on the Unity engine. We could probably do our own raycasts and roll our own system, but it's expensive for what it is, and it's also kind of limited. So since we basically divested the combat system from all the Unity engine APIs, we had to come up with something else, and a lot of commendation here has to go to my friend Fabian Dreher, he's in Germany. He has a math PhD, and he helped me figure out a lot of the hex math. It'd probably be more accurate to say he did most of the hex math, and I mostly implemented it with the combat system and did performance optimizations and bug fixes and that sort of stuff. So here we can see a little bit of a tool that I used to debug the combat system a bit, and we can see a representation of the hex grid, and we have different indices for each hex. And what we could do is let's say, for example, that I have a unit that's in hex 17, so we'll add hex 17 as the start, and it's trying to fire at a unit in hex 59. And what we can do is we can see all the different intersects between all of the different hexes that this line comes across. So we can see that there's what we're calling an interior intersect at hex 17. It's called interior because it's inside the hex. We have two full edge intersections, one at 37, one at 38. And we have another interior intersect at 59. So if we were doing this with raycasts, here's where something interesting happens. So you'd end up having a collider on these hexes that have the asteroids that are supposed to block shots. But what happens here if you make the collider the same size as the hex itself, and you have a line that goes through the edge of that hex? At that point, it becomes ambiguous whether a collision occurs or not. If you have, at least the way that this worked in Dominus Galaxia before this rework, is sometimes that would go through and sometimes would be blocked. If there were two asteroids beside each other, that would pretty much always be blocked. But what we really want is to have some sort of consistent behavior. So now what happens is, I'm just going to move this over one to demonstrate. If we have only one full edge that is an asteroid hex, then the shot goes through. It's not blocked. If the shot were to go like that, and it were an interior intersect that went through an asteroid hex, it would still be blocked. But if there's just this one and it's just the edge, then it goes through. However, we'll go 59, 17. If there are two full edge intersections that are asteroids, and it doesn't matter if we say went all the way up to 101 here. It wouldn't matter if this was an asteroid and that was an asteroid, or these two are asteroids. As long as there are two or more that are full edge intersections that contain asteroids, then it will be blocked. So it's a lot more consistent behavior, and we can potentially do some really interesting mechanical stuff. And it's complicated, but this actually does come into play a lot when it comes to repulsors. and specific edge case behaviors. So, for example, if you're repulsing something and it just goes a little bit inside, the path that it would take is just, say, let's see if we can set something up here. So let's say we have 98 and we're repulsing to, will 204 do it? Yeah. So if we're repulsing from 98 to 204, I'm not sure if this would actually work or if it would catch on 19, but at some point, let's say maybe 225. No, that doesn't quite work. But yeah, at some point, if the intersection is small enough, in one of the hexes that goes along that path, it will ignore that and it will just repulse past it. And that felt really bad when that wasn't in place with repulsors. It sort of felt like things would get stuck randomly. And now it seems like we found like a good middle ground where you never think, oh, that's a weird behavior. So there's undoubtedly a whole bunch of other mechanics that could come into play with this, especially if we ever add things like fighters that operate outside the hex grid. This is kind of a way to convert between things that operate outside the hex grid and things that are constrained to the hex grid. The other thing you can see here is length and adjusted length. So if we do something more simple like 36 to 78 here. So we have the actual length, which is the length of this line in world units, is 1.5. But hexes are weird. This distance is not the same as that distance is not the same as something that is, in between the two, because they're pointy. They aren't radial. They aren't well, they're symmetrical, but lines will be different lengths depending on the angle that they're going. So we basically convert between the two. So something like this, that should always be 2 hexes. And yeah, that's just kind of cool. And missiles before didn't use anything like that, I don't think. Now they do. So yeah, before, depending on the angle that they'd go, they might go a bit further or less far in terms of hexes. Now they're consistent. So the last thing we added just very recently was a new tutorial. So before we had the system where the first time you click on something or the first time a mechanic comes into play or you open the ship design screen, whatever, you'd have this little prompt that would come up and explain things for you. And we still have that, but we also have this other thing, which is the guided tutorial, where you have a bunch of instructions and you follow them, and as you follow them, it teaches you how to play the game. So this still needs to be tested on more people that haven't played Dominus Galaxia before, and that just sort of needs some observation. But I think it's pretty good right now, and between the two different systems, hopefully it's a lot easier to learn the game. So this is mainly, it doesn't deal with everything. It doesn't go into diplomacy. For example, maybe a later version will go into diplomacy, but for the most part, it's teaching you the basics. It's teaching you how to move your ships, how to select different amounts of ships, how to form new colonies, build starports, do research, design new ships, and a little bit of with the combat at the end. And this is definitely going to morph a little bit over time, but it's something that was really required, a prerequisite in order to eventually put the game on early access. Because otherwise, I think we just have too many people that would just try and play the game and would end up confused. in terms of what to expect in the coming few months here, the thing that I'm immediately working on is a rework of the neutrals, and this is to make them more of a first-class element in the game. So instead of just guarding planets, you'll have things like pirate bases. Pirates are going to evolve over time. Their designs will get more advanced. They'll send out raiding parties. And the current idea is when you defeat a pirate base, you can also get a number of goodies. So that should be fun. And it's a good idea to have more things that you could do in the game than just making war with everybody else, especially for new players who might be a little bit shy, might not want to be at war, and if you're playing on a low difficulty, the AI probably doesn't want to be too war hungry either. So those guys should hopefully have a much better time, but it should, I think, help with everybody. The next thing will be some reworking of the diplomacy, and specifically we're going to bring back a version of the Galactic Council. And a number of 4X games have had something like this, but it's most famous in Mass of Orion 1 and 2, where everybody would come together and vote for one of the empires to rule the galaxy. Big problem there is that the player is never going to vote for somebody else to win, and good AI would never do that either. So it kind of just wouldn't work in multiplayer, for example. And I think that aspect of it makes it not very interesting. It's more of a way to exit out of the game early. But I think what we could do is we can do a bit of a tweak here so that it's interesting, that it works with an AI that is playing for itself, and actually makes the rest of diplomacy better also, because it could become an interconnected part of it. And the idea here is, first of all, instead of everybody voting in sequence, the vote would need to be blind, and everybody's vote is revealed at the same time. But second would be the ability to use votes as a resource. So, if I'm like really strong, if I have a really strong empire and I'm fighting against a weak empire or a weaker empire, probably I just want to continue fighting them until I conquer all of their planets and they sort of disappear from the map. And that's not very interesting in a few ways. It makes the game world less rich, the less actors you have in it, the less empires, and also it requires a lot of mop-up, and it's repetitive. But what if at a certain point, then, that empire that you're at war with would agree to peace if they vote for you for the next 4 sessions of the council? Then you can accumulate enough votes to win the game that way. So I think that would be a lot more of an interesting way to go about it. But of course, this is forward-looking and things could change. It might not be exactly the way that I've described, but I'm hoping to have this stuff out in the coming few months here. Ivan is also putting in a lot of work on the data system. So Ivan was responsible for the current data system that we use. And if you aren't aware, Dominus Galaxia, a lot of the stuff is driven through external data files that are plain text and easy to modify rather than hard-coded or something that can't be accessed by the player. So special devices, for example, don't have a concept of healing. They have a concept of look for a hit points variable and increase that hit points variable at the start of the turn. But it could also be every 3 turns, or it could depend on other variables being in place. It's just a really powerful system. But it's not very performant, and evaluation takes a lot more time than it would if it were native code. And what Ivan is doing is he's he's migrating that to a new version that uses expression trees, which are much closer to native execution than what we have now. So in terms of just the pure expression evaluation, that should speed us up by an order of magnitude, probably, maybe more. In terms of how much it will actually speed up turn processing, it's hard. We don't know yet. We won't know until we actually are able to play a game with it and do some benchmarking. But what it will do, regardless of how much it actually speeds us up right now, it will open the door in the future so that we can expose it a lot more without having to think too much about performance or risk everything slowing down. So there's a bunch of stuff in combat. Some stuff is exposed, some stuff isn't, because these are things that we're accessing like hundreds upon hundreds of times, or possibly thousands of times in an event, and we want these events to happen really fast in the background. So that's it for this update. This covers about the space between January and the end of October. So there will be another update that will come out at around the start of each month, and the next one will be around the start of December. And I will see you all then. Take care.